really interesting. We're talking a lot about connection, but a lot of the mental health awareness stuff is very individually focused. You don't have to feel this bad. You can get help. You know, you will feel better. But we're also responsible to each other, and sometimes we need other people to say to us, hey, you look tired, or you look like you're worried, or you're doing that thing with your hand again that you do when you're feeling anxious. Is everything okay? People want more than an absence of suffering. We want more.
Welcome to Connection Academy podcast. I'm your host, Kristen Ransom. Today's conversation is with Dr. Trudy Meehan, who has specialised in both clinical and social psychology and is currently a lecturer at the Centre of Positive Psychology and Health at the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland. Together we had an incredibly rich conversation on mental health, what it is, what it isn't, how to become more aware of your own mental state, and our collective responsibility to better support one another. Lean in and enjoy the conversation. So, we're chatting about mental health. It's a really important pillar of what's happening in the world at the moment and has largely been happening. We just haven't been speaking about it. Also, just to give you a bit of background, Trudy, in terms of why I'm passionate about mental health. I found this statement and I'll read it to you. It says here, mental health influences how you think and feel about yourself and others, and how you interpret life as it happens around you. It affects our capacity to learn, to communicate, and to form and sustain relationships. It also influences our ability to cope with change, transition, and life events. And this really made me think, well, mental health is fundamentally impacting our overall experience of life. You know, when I processed that, I just thought, wow, how many people right now are out there not having a full experience of life? And to me, that was a call to action to start a conversation and this platform where we could loop people such as yourself who have a wealth of knowledge on the topic to share a bit more about it.
That's such a comprehensive definition of mental health. I really like that. And it's a great starting point to talk about it as well. Yeah.
With that, maybe we could just start off you introducing yourself and a bit more about the work that you do.
I've got an interesting background in that I've a mix of traditional psychology in terms of clinical psychology, which traditionally, I guess, looks at people who are suffering or have a lack of mental health. But I also have training in social psychology, which looks at really a broad area of people as social animals, of people in context, people in society, and people in the lived environment. So for me, I bring the two of those together when I think about mental health. Coming from both of those backgrounds, at the moment, I'm lecturing in positive psychology, which is another, I guess, evolution within psychology and another rotation in how we think about people. And positive psychology makes sense to me because of where I've come from in terms of working with people who were largely presenting with suffering. And needing to get away from their pain and suffering, and then seeing the limits of that work and wondering where can you go outside of that work. And I guess because I come from a mix of traditional clinical psychology and social psychology, I've always been aware that working with an individual to try and fix or move forward or repair or talk through the individual issue is never enough. And part of my training in social psychology is to see the person in the context and to see that a lot of what are so-called individual problems actually have a social or political origin. So I would have been an unusual clinical psychologist in that I was always quite cynical about an individual approach to human health and wellness. And I think then from that cynical starting point, working with people who experienced a lot of suffering, then wondering where else can we go, finding positive psychology pointed to a way forward that really said people want more than an absence of suffering. We want more. As humans, that's kind of what we're interested in. We're not just interested in ending suffering. We're interested in finding meaning, engagement, and all of those things you talked about there in your definition of mental health and wellness. So That's me in terms of my professional trajectory and my path. I'm a psychologist who brings in a suspicion of wholly individual focused solutions and a desire to see things as politically embedded, but also this strange optimism, which is partly just who I am and partly from the science of positive psychology, that there's more to life than suffering and that it can be found, and we have tricks and tools and hacks that we can use to take people from zero, which would be the absence of suffering, to plus something, which is meaning and engagement and positive emotions. Yeah.
Wow, so you really have such a wealth of knowledge on so many different core pillars of psychology. I really like that positive psychology is really about going over and above suffering and really giving people something positive to aspire towards. And it's almost like a big pillar of hope. That's kind of what I was thinking as you were explaining it. Yes, I mean, with that as the background and echoing that definition that I read, saying that mental health really impacts your overall experience of life, why do you think that this conversation is one that matters now, probably more so than ever?
I think it's really important for two reasons. One is the first, which you've already said, that mental health impacts how you interpret your life and your whole experience of it. And you can break that down into lots of things. What the interesting thing is that we know we have a huge capacity to change how we interpret our experience based on our thoughts. So we have quite a bit of control once we learn the tricks and get some awareness on what's happening inside of our bodies. So I think it's really important because there is a point there where we can intervene and we can change the direction and we can change how we interpret things to improve our mental health. So it's important from that because it is a point at which we can have a huge impact on our lives. But I think there's another reason why we really need to have this conversation at the moment, and you touched on it earlier. The idea that mental health has been used so much, the term, it's in danger of becoming meaningless. And it means everything and nothing all at once. So I think it's really important to talk about it and to talk critically about it as well, because it's used interchangeably. I worked in a service, in the health service. Our official title was Child and Adolescent Mental Health. But the service was for young people who were experiencing moderate to severe psychiatric diagnosis. So it's very different than mental health. It would be a traditional illness model, and you had to have received a diagnosis which put you in the category of having an illness, and it needed to be moderate or severe. But the service was called Child and Adolescent Mental Health. So it was very confusing for people, and people didn't meet the criteria to be admitted into the service because the level of distress wasn't severe enough to be a diagnosable illness, and so on. So I think people get really confused and they get really frustrated because a lot of people go to services for help with their mental health, and then they're turned away from the service because they don't meet the admission criteria for that service. And often the words used are very confusing for people, and mental health is used for too broad a spectrum of human experiences.
Yeah, and I love that you mentioned the spectrum, because I think that is such a point of confusion for people, and often where I find the conversation goes astray. It's important to differentiate between the health part and the illness part. Just like we all have physical health, but we don't all have physical disease or physical illness. Maybe if you could give a bit more of a practical, simple definition of differentiating those two.
I think they're very different. I think the spectrum model has some value in that it allows people to step on to saying they're not 100% in terms of where they're feeling. They're not feeling well. They might be feeling a little bit of distress. They might be feeling a little bit of suffering, and they want to share that. And it takes away the stigma and the shame in saying, I'm not okay. But I think the other thing the spectrum does then is it blurs that boundary between wellness and illness or ill health or disease, to the extent that you can't really you're taking away from the meaning of each, because they're on the same line, but they're actually very different. So I think, there's quite a big definition of both, but we'll start with the positive. So, you know, if we look at wellness or health in terms of mental health, there's so many definitions. But from a positive psychology point of view, there's an easy definition that has 5 components. The easy way to remember it is PERMA, PERMA. And Martin Seligman, who's one of the founders of positive psychology, defined wellness using these 5 components. And they can be broken down. So you have your P, which is positive emotion or pleasurable feelings. And that's what everybody understands. It's like, I feel pleasure, I'm eating some chocolate, it's really tasty, or I'm looking at a beautiful sunset, I feel this pleasure from the view and all of that, and you get positive emotions. Oftentimes we stop at that and we think that's what happiness means, or wellness, or positive mental health. But that's a very simple definition, and it's only one of 5 components of mental health or mental wellness. And oftentimes we don't feel pleasure, but we feel the 4 other things. So pleasure isn't the be all and end all of happiness or mental health. So it's important to say that. The other components then of mental health and wellness that positive psychology talks about are engagement. So that's that thing of flow. So there's a guy, Csikszentmihalyi, and Csikszentmihalyi talks about flow. And the interesting thing about flow is it's actually the absence of feeling. You don't feel pleasure when you're in flow. You feel nothing. You feel at one with the music, or if you're dancing, your body disappears and you're just moving. If you're painting something, or if you're in the kitchen cooking, you're just doing the thing. You're absolutely absorbed. Time disappears and you're doing. And it's the absence of feeling. So it's very different than the pleasurable feeling. But that leads to a lot of happiness and feelings of wellness. Then one that's, I guess, quite obvious, positive relationships, connection. And that's really important to feeling well and feeling happiness. Meaning then is another one that's really important. And that can be spiritual meaning. It can be meaning in your work. But it can be meaning in really small things, like tending to a garden, planting a tree, taking the rubbish off the beach, just finding something that you're making a contribution to and that means something for you. And doing the small things, maybe doing a compassion meditation and just putting good feelings out into the world. And then the last thing in PERMA is the A, and that's accomplishment. And again, that's not massive things. It's not big things. Like, it doesn't have to be getting a PhD or being a rock star. It's the small things. It's just that feeling of mastery, of setting a goal for yourself and feeling like you've achieved it. So it's your own accomplishment. So it's doing something and pushing beyond what you thought was possible. So those 4 things, that PERMA, positive emotion, engagement, relationships, meaning and accomplishment, that's a definition of happiness and mental health. And that when you have most of those things, you're in the zone.
Wow, I really like that. You can almost break it down into that clear framework, because I just think about how I process my own emotions, and often it does involve getting out a notebook and writing some things down. And without some kind of guide or framework, it's easy to feel like just getting lost in that. And I'm just thinking about how those different buckets that you've just mentioned can be used to kind of guide the thought process of unpacking your thoughts and emotions.
Yeah, and it's really important, especially Martin Seligman is really strong on the idea that pleasure and pleasurable emotions isn't the final thing about happiness. And he speaks about how kind of 50% of your ability to feel pleasurable emotions is hereditary. And we can only change about 15 to 20% of that with psychological intervention. So some people are just born feeling lots of pleasure. They're quite joyful, they're giggly. That's who they are in terms of their disposition. Other people are more serious, more reserved. They don't feel a lot of pleasure. But that doesn't mean that they're not happy or that they're not mentally well. It's just a different way of experiencing the world. And people who don't feel that really strong waves of pleasure will feel engagement and flow. They'll feel meaning and accomplishment. So there's often a kind of a TV version of happiness that isn't accessible to all of us, and that isn't the only version of happiness, if that makes sense.
I really love that you mentioned this, because it makes me think, if we were able to become a bit more self-aware it would also help the effectiveness of us taking action on our mental health. Because, I mean, as an example, if I'm comparing myself to my friend who might be super high energy and happy all the time and in this more pleasure state, as you've mentioned, but that's not my predisposition, it could be easy for me to perhaps feel a bit lost in terms of why am I not like that? Meanwhile, I could perhaps lean on the other pillars that you've mentioned, such as finding areas in my life that I can craft meaning into.
Exactly. I think that's really important. And I think we're often set on the wrong track because we feel like we need to be like somebody else who looks like they're happy. And that's really the wrong way to go. And can send us down a lot of misery and unnecessary misery. So I think that's kind of wellness and positive mental health. And that, like, all of those 5 factors sit on a spectrum for me, in that you can have more or less of those things. And if you have very little of all of those things, then you're likely to be having poor mental health. And your mental health is likely to be causing you some problems. But for me, what would be classified as mental illness or a psychiatric diagnosis or something needing a medicalized intervention, either from psychiatry or psychology in terms of clinical psychology, is very different than everything on that spectrum. And the difference is in the duration of the bad feeling and the impact of that feeling on your ability to function. So in terms of officially diagnosing somebody with what we could call an illness, and I'm just using the word illness just for handiness, in terms of it needs just to keep it very strongly cordoned off from mental health and generalized unhappiness. I really want to emphasize that it's quite a different experience. I'm just using illness because it's a radically different word, but we could call it dis-ease or suffering. When you're in that space, first of all, it needs to be enduring. So for at least 2 weeks, every day, not just some days in that 2 weeks, it needs to be for every day in at least 2 weeks. And then it needs to impact on your functioning, either your work functioning, your school functioning, your self-care, your ability to just do general things around the house. And it needs to significantly impact on your functioning. So you can't do the things you would normally do at all. We all have times when we're on the spectrum of mental health, where we're having a bad mental health day, where we are unproductive, where we don't get dressed or we don't shower, or we eat junk food because we couldn't get the energy to make a healthy meal and we didn't exercise and all of those things. That is not a clinically significant drop in functioning. That's just a normal bad day. So I think it's really important to emphasize that when you have a clinically significant deterioration, the drop in your functioning is massive. It's severe and it's really impactful. It impacts on your life and it will impact on the lives of other people around you as well. Other people will notice it. And I think it's important to differentiate that, because I worry that people who feel and are in a position where they are genuinely that distressed and struggling to function, when people have something on the spectrum of a general bad mental health day, that it can minimize their experience. When somebody suffering from clinical anxiety and somebody who feels a little bit anxious because they're worried about a test or a big event coming up, and they empathize and say, yeah, I know, I feel really anxious at the moment as well. It can be minimizing and it can kind of erase their experience because they're so different in the lived experience of them. And how to address them is often very different as well.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you raised this, because I think that's a challenge that so many of us face, is how to really hold space for someone that is suffering.
Yeah.
What does that look like? And, you know, I think stepping into the space of empathizing with them, while that action is not wrong just in and of itself, it often does come from a space of good intentions. As you've said, sometimes it can further isolate them and make them feel alone.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just curious in terms of, if you have a friend or family member who you believe is suffering, what would it look like to best support them?
That's a really good question. Genuine curiosity, because it's so easy, and like I do it myself. I'm trained not to do it, but I still do it. It's so easy to run to that. Oh, I know, I also feel like that sometimes, because we all feel all of the emotions. We all feel anxious, we all feel sad, we all feel shame, we feel guilt. So we know what those feelings feel like, but we haven't all experienced a psychiatric diagnosis, and we haven't all experienced mental illness, so we don't know. So I think genuine curiosity is really important, just to ask the person how they're, not just how they're feeling, but what's happening for them, what it's like for them. Ask them what they need and accept what they need. And, you know, just kind of, and they might not need anything, and allow that. The other thing that we have to accept is, I don't know, this sounds quite harsh, but I see it in lay people, I see it in professional people. We are incredibly uncomfortable with other people suffering. We want to fix it, we want it to go away. And I think it's really hard to say to people, but we have to allow people to suffer, and we have to allow suffering to exist in the world, knowing that it's not going to be there forever, knowing that help is available and that people will move forward. But oftentimes we pressurize people in a well-meaning way, but it's because we find their suffering intolerable. And it's finding a way to tolerate seeing somebody else in pain, and somebody that you love in pain, and to sit with them. And it's okay to say, it's really hard for me to see you in pain, but I'm going to stay beside you. I think one of our reactions is to try and fix it, or to walk away, and we get frustrated with the person if they don't kind of respond quickly enough, or we try, it doesn't work, and we leave the room, or we storm out, or we quietly stopped contacting that friend because we have this perception that they're just always moaning or something. But that's our problem in a sense, because we're not able to tolerate their distress. And I think we need to stay connected. We need to keep touching in, even when people, it feels like they're rejecting our help sometimes, but it's just that they don't need our help. They just need our solidarity. They need us beside them. And oftentimes they need our position as helpers or supporters is either beside somebody or behind them. If you're in front of somebody and you feel like you're trying to encourage them to step forward, then take a step back and get back behind that person. We have no business being in front of somebody trying to pull them forward. People have the capacity to move forward. And I think we need to respect people's capacities as well. People have the capacity to move forward. And they're, you know, we can signpost, we can stand behind or beside and say, look, I see something on the horizon, and there's something else over there to the left, and there's something else over there to the right that might be helpful. You don't have to go there right now, but I just wanted to point them out. I'm here beside you, and I'll go on the journey with you. But if we feel like we're pulling, then we need to step back and just wait a little bit longer. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it makes a lot of sense. I know I was thinking about it in terms of why is it important to raise awareness about mental health and mental illness? And I think it's largely about us creating space for people who are suffering or who are perhaps on a negative part of the mental health spectrum. Because one of our fundamental needs as human beings is for love and belonging. And as long as we are not creating space for people, we are not allowing people to have that need for love and belonging. What would it mean to still belong in this space, even though you are suffering? And you raised the point of being tolerant. And it's interesting because I think often we think, I'm having a conversation with a friend or family member who's suffering. It can feel like they are the one that needs to do all the work to make this better. Meanwhile, I think this point of tolerance is so key in terms of us as a collective moving forward into a space where we can embrace collective well-being, because it's not a road that's easy to walk by yourself. And when you say that we need to be beside each other and behind each other, that means that we're doing that arm in arm, and we can only do that once we create space for one another.
Exactly. I think it's really important. We need to make that space for each other, and we need to just be patient. around people when they're in distress. And we need to be patient with ourselves when we can't fix things. We're in a culture that's really very impatient, and everything's fixable. Everything, you can find a solution to nearly everything all the time now. And sometimes with suffering and heartache, time is important as well. And that human connection piece is really important. Yeah.
Yeah, I just think, the whole notion of awareness is so important and on more bases than one. How do we hold space for one another? But just going all the way back, how do we acknowledge when we are perhaps on a negative part of the mental health spectrum, or perhaps are in a space where, hey, this may have progressed to mental illness?
Yeah.
I'm not sure if you've got any feedback or advice on that.
I think you touched on it earlier when you were talking about self-awareness, and that's really important. It's a big part of, there's a WRAP model, it's the Wellness and Recovery Action Program, and it's around like knowing what your process is when you're starting to feel like you're going down, who to ask for help, who can tell you when you're coming off your path. And it's all about awareness. So I think we can't do it alone. I think that's the thing. And it's really interesting. We're talking a lot about connection, but a lot of the mental health awareness stuff is very individually focused. You don't have to feel this bad. You can get help. You will feel better. But we're also responsible to each other. And sometimes we need other people to say to us, hey, you look tired, or you look like you're worried, or you're doing that thing with your hand again that you do when you're feeling anxious. Is everything okay? So for me, the things that I'm self-aware about, I've learned to be self-aware about them because other people pointed them out to me first. So we need, I think, other people, and it's not fair to expect that we would have this wonderful self-awareness just magically that we wake up with. We learn from other people. We're social beings, and we need to see ourselves from outside of ourselves to have self-awareness. And that can come from really epic, excellent parenting. But we don't all have really epic, excellent parenting where parents reflect, or caregivers reflect back to us, how, our emotions change and how our behaviors kind of reflect our emotions and all of that. So it can start when we're young, but for most of us it doesn't. And we learn from other people we're in relationships with, be it friends or partners or colleagues. Yep. So other people are responsible as well as ourselves. So self-awareness, it's really interesting. I had a conversation this week with colleagues and talking about how did they learn to know what good felt like. I think we have to start taking notice of when we feel good, because we can only really know that we're coming off track or off our path if we know what good feels like. And I think that's part of the problem for a lot of people, and how we end up with mental health that we're not happy with. We don't even know that we've come off a path because we didn't know what good felt like. We don't know where good is. We don't know what that is. We haven't been to that land. We haven't explored it. Nobody showed us good mental health. We haven't had a lot of opportunity in our lives to feel that. So you don't know that you're in a bad place oftentimes. So I think it begins with finding good spaces and starting to register what those safe places or good spaces or nurturing spaces, or when you're feeling at peace when those things happen and come up. And that happens individually by being aware, but also collectively. So I think it becomes a process of taking stock of when you feel good. And only after that can you notice when you feel bad.
That's a really great point. So overall, having a deeper level of self-awareness and I guess living a bit more consciously, paying closer attention to yourself. And I think the world that we're living in, you have to be really intentional about that when there is so much that is demanding our attention. And especially in this time where we are working from home, many of us, we're spending more time online. So I think building up awareness to say, hey, this attention belongs to me, and how am I going to spend it and share it? It takes a lot of discipline and determination.
Yeah, and I think it's really hard. So that's why I get frustrated sometimes with conversations about mental health, because it's like, you need to be aware when you're falling off the spectrum. It's like, how can I know this? You know, like,
Yeah.
and oftentimes we don't know until it's too late, and it manifests as a physical symptom. So it's things like we're not sleeping, or there's been a change in our physical body that we don't like, or we're feeling stiff or achy, or we're getting headaches and that kind of thing. So oftentimes it's not until something really physical or in our faces hits us that we can feel it, and then we notice.
Mm.
So it can be a hard process to become aware.
Something I'd like to bounce off of you too is two, I guess, emotional states that I love chatting about and exploring. And that would be the role of shame and the
Yeah,
role of compassion on the other side of that. And I saw a really great definition, and it said, looking that love and belonging are a fundamental need that human beings have. Shame can almost be expressed as the fear of rejection of love and belonging.
yeah,
And we've been speaking a lot about what would it mean to hold space for someone to express themselves and all that they're feeling, and really look that harsh reality in the eye and not want to run away from it or suppress it by saying, hey, I feel that too, but really just hold the space for them. But then on the flip side, what would compassion mean? And I think that this needs to be discussed in terms of self-compassion and having compassion for others, because if someone has the courage and confidence to express their mental state, and they are not met with someone who is able to hold space for them, self-compassion is really important in that moment. And on the other side of that, the person who should be holding the space needs to do so with compassion. So maybe if you could explain or detail what that would mean for you.
that's a really great question. And I think you're right about shame. It can be the big thing that shame does is it alienates and isolates us from others. And then the flip side of that is it can make us really angry and want to lash out because of it's so painful to feel shame. And we get angry because, if you're alienated and isolated, what else do you do? So a lot of young people and teenagers feel shame, and then there's a cycle of lashing out, and then nobody has compassion for them because they just look angry,
Mm,
and so on. So it can become a really big cycle. And I think compassion is really important because it's about more than feeling sorry for. It's about feeling it's about acknowledging and seeing somebody's pain, and acknowledging that one might have to take action. Um, and so it becomes a shared thing. It's not just the other person might have to take action and you're sorry for them that their life is so bad or that they feel in this awful way. You're feeling that something is bad or sad, or that they don't want is happening for them. But in feeling that compassion, there's a momentum within you that you would be willing to reach out and
mm,
do something or take a stand for them. And I like the idea of compassion because for me, if you have compassion in terms of mental health, oftentimes what it requires is a huge action in terms of social action. Because I think a lot of our mental health issues are created by an unequal society or pressures from our social structures that we need to stand up and say no to and be part of a broader change. So compassion compels us to act, and or at least to be willing to act.
mm,
And I think that's why it's really important, because in compassion, we're saying, you're not saying, I feel what you feel. You're saying, I feel what you feel, and it disturbs me also. And it disturbs me enough that it's shaken me out of where I'm at, and I would be willing to stand alongside or stand up with you or take a stand, about this issue, because I
mm,
don't think it's okay either. So it's a solidarity. There's a solidarity and compassion, I think,
mm,
that's really quite strong.
mm,
And it's a remedy for shame then, because if shame is alienating, if you're feeling compassion to the extent that you would stand with or for somebody, then they matter and they count, and they're not shameful at all because you're willing to put something on the line for somebody else, even if it's just that you're willing to have your heart ache for them or with them, but you're willing to put something of yourself on the line for them, which means they count as something or they're valuable. And I think that's more important sometimes than possibly like a very specific intervention, that a scientist or a medic has designed to intervene. Oftentimes people who seek help and get help, sometimes they talk about the impact of the fact that somebody cared and that somebody stretched themselves and went beyond themselves to show them that they mattered, and that that's something that's really important, and that's really healing. And I think it's healing because it takes the edge off shame.
I'm thinking about the different ways you could respond in this regard, depending on who it is. You might have somebody express their mental state who is a colleague who you might not be that close with, or you might have your partner or your best friend express their mental state. So in the case where it's your partner or best friend, I would think it's perhaps easier to step into that space of uncomfortableness and just address it with love and care and really hold it with them and be there as you've explained. But with people that are perhaps on the outer circle of your life, it might be a bit more scary. This is just a practical example of how a colleague of mine has inspired me to hold space for others, is simply to just thank them for sharing. I think if there was one thing that you could say to someone who's shared something vulnerable, is just to thank them, because in that moment you make them feel seen.
Yeah.
And
that's really nice. Yeah.
If you don't have the deeper love to give them, which I think it is important to say, it's not always easy to go into that deeper state.
Exactly.
Just let them know that you see them.
Exactly. And oftentimes that's all that's required. It's to let somebody know that they've been seen and to not try and erase them. Because sometimes we freak out. Like if somebody gives us vulnerability, it freaks us out and we try and like make it stop. And we try and put the lid on it. And then they feel erased by that action. And it's okay. I think the big thing also is to say, wow, that's really a big thing that you've shared with me. I don't know what to say to that right now, but thanks for sharing. Like you said, thanks for sharing. It's okay to say, I don't know what to say. It's better almost to say, I don't know what to say, than to try and like say something to shut them up, if that makes sense.
To fill the gap.
Yeah, exactly. And just say, wow, that's big. Even just, wow, that's big. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah.
Thanks for trusting me.
I think about people in my life that have really made me feel seen. I really set the intention at the beginning of the year to focus on what it would mean to lean into self-expression. And it's been interesting to observe how people have received that. Sometimes when I've expressed myself from a state of vulnerability, often the people that do not fill the gap, in other words, they do just go, oh, thanks for sharing. It really inspires me, because then I can think, hey, this person's actually thinking about what I just said. And it's often those people that come back a few days later that would say, hey, Chris, I really thought about what you said. And then they come with the whole pack of a new perspective, which is so much more valuable than them reacting in the way that they communicate rather than responding. So I think it's definitely inspiring to know that sometimes all we have to do is say thank you and leave it at that.
I think that's really helpful, and it goes along that thing of we don't have to fix everything. It's okay to just let things exist. So to let vulnerability exist, and it's wonderful. It needs to exist in the world, and just let it live.
Yeah. Just to close off, I just also wanted to chat about the magnitude of mental health. Often we easily place value on physical health, and we can see, especially now, given the COVID-19 pandemic, we can see the direct impact of it because it is external, not always, but a lot of the time. But we hear these stats about mental health being this really big global crisis. I wonder if you could speak into that.
Here's the thing I think about mental health issues. They're treatable. There's stuff we can do to help. Just because it doesn't look like it's working, or there isn't an X-ray machine and a bandage that you can put on, doesn't mean that there aren't treatments there. There are people who are trained And there are treatments that are available that work and that can alleviate suffering and can stop mental health conditions from developing and getting worse. They can pull them back, they can, cure them, they can treat them, and so on. And I think that's the important thing that we need to remember, and that people need to advocate for going forward, because it is unseen, and often the treatment is quite unseen because it's not flashy. Somebody goes into a clinic, they get treatment, they come out, they look the same on the outside, but they have changed immeasurably on the inside, but it doesn't look any different. So it can be hard to quantify. So it can be hard to push for funding for it and for buildings to exist where these treatments happen and these changes take place. And I think because of the mental health continuum, it can be easy to minimize these issues and to say that they don't need funding and that they don't need buildings and places and people who can do the treatment and people who can do the work, because we think that it's just a bad day, and it's not that. So the mental health tsunami that people talk about that's coming down the line is real, in terms of the distress and suffering that people will feel is real. It's not the normal kind of bad day stuff. It's significant. It will have an impact on people's lives, on how they work, on families, on individuals. But most importantly, it's treatable. So there is an option, and we have pathways to intervene, and we have no excuse not to intervene because we have the science. We just need the facilities and the structures in place. And I think, so I think that's really important.
If someone was just starting off on their journey of mental health and becoming a bit more self-aware, what would be one thing you could encourage them to do today?
There's an exercise called the 3 good things exercise. And at the end of every day, you write down 3 good things that happened. So the 3 good things exercise starts to make you aware of what good looks like for you, but it also sharpens your focus into how easily we go to the negative. So it has a dual role in that it helps us recognize good, so that then we start to become more aware if we're moving away from good. So I would recommend that. And it has the added bonus is that by doing the 3 good things exercise, you start to develop gratitude. And gratitude is really important for mental health. So you start becoming mentally healthier by doing the exercise. So you're going to become more aware of what good is in your life. You'll become aware initially of how hard it is for you to track good and how easy it is for you to go to bad and negative. And then you'll develop gratefulness and mental health from doing the exercise, if that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense. Yeah, I guess simple but difficult, and I would think it might get easier as you go.
It gets easier.
It's funny that you mentioned that. I've got on my wall here. I did it last year when I first moved over to Ireland. I printed out a whole bunch of calendars for each month, and at the end of each day, I just wrote one highlight, even if it was having a great coffee in the morning. And I put 6 months worth of calendars on in March, and I remember standing there looking at August on all these blank pages thinking, wow, I wonder where we will be now then. And looking at my calendar, it's been really amazing for me to look at how I've intentionally been able to bake in all of my passions and hobbies over the time. You know, we were speaking about that in the beginning of this conversation. And I looked at last year's calendar, which was jam-packed with social activities and just so different. But I wouldn't say I was happier at that same time. So yeah, it's a really beautiful exercise that does just help you see, well, what actually does bring me happiness. And often it is just those small moments in the day. And when you can become more aware of them, you can just be more present in them.
That's exactly it. A lot of happiness is synthesized happiness, in terms of we become happy with what we have and where we're at, rather than hoping for something that's around the corner. It's around appreciating and being grateful for where we are. And that's no less happy than, kind of the Hollywood happy, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Trudy. It's been really amazing just hearing your perspective on mental health and why it's an important conversation. I can definitely see the many different avenues that I want to explore with you further. But thanks so much for giving us your time and your perspective.
Thanks very much. You're very welcome.